jurisprudential background to Smith versus Allwright?
Well, it's a specific one with regard to the 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment was supposed to guarantee the right for African Americans or states could not discriminate against African Americans to vote. But early on in 1876 in U.S. versus Reese, the Supreme Court limited Congress's ability to enforce the 15th Amendment. So after that, states, primarily Southern but not exclusively, began to adopt various techniques, tricks to prevent African Americans from voting. These ranged from poll taxes to literacy tests, but those were problematic because they also excluded white voters as well. So around the time of the 20th century, states began to adopt what was known as the white primary. Texas was the state that initiated it, which was the argument that the general election, anybody could vote, but in the Democratic primary, only whites could vote, and they explicitly excluded African Americans. There's several cases that bounce back and forth from the Supreme Court. The court says that they couldn't do this, that it was state action. So eventually what happened was the Texas Democratic Party set up, it called its own convention, and said that we're going to allow only whites to participate in the primary. And the argument behind this, at least from Texas's point of view, was this was not state action and therefore was not a violation of the 14th Amendment. And the court eventually held that that was private activities and therefore was not a violation of the 14th Amendment.
Okay. What role did Thurgood Marshall in the NAACP play in the case?
Well, what was important about this was that the NAACP had been working both before World War II and then after World War II on trying to get some of these court cases, and U.S. versus Reese was the court case dealing with the essentially gutting of the 15th Amendment, but there were the slaughterhouse cases. I mean, there are numerous cases where the Supreme Court had limited the Civil War amendments, most notably Plessy versus Ferguson. And so the NAACP had a strategy to try and slowly and incrementally get the Supreme Court of the United States to move its jurisprudence. And so it was very much a deliberate strategy to take apart those legal obstacles that were in the way of African Americans, not least of which was this really rather strained argument because of the South was solidly Democratic, so whoever won the Democratic primary effectively won the office. So by saying that this was a private activity was not very convincing, only as a legal formalism. And so the NAACP understood this and tried to move the court in that direction.
This is not in my list, but I'm going to throw it in because this is going to people who were born in many cases in the 1990s. We wouldn't think of the Democratic Party these days as being a party that was promoting segregation. What was different about it in the period that we're talking about?
Yeah, and this is where it's a long and complicated story, but after the Civil War and after Reconstruction, the Democratic Party, at least in the South, championed itself as the redeemers or the reestablishment of white supremacy. And so during this period, the Democratic Party was best known in the American South for being the staunch supporter of white supremacy. And the battles in this period tended to be between the Republicans, who were after things like anti-lynching laws and the like, and the Democratic Party held the line. All of this begins to change with the election of FDR in 1932, the New Deal, by federal aid coming to poor places, especially the South. The Democratic Party tried to funnel that aid exclusively to whites. They worried that it would destabilize the racial situation. And so the New Deal coalition and then World War II puts enormous strain on the Democratic Party's hold in the American South. This was a one-party South, meaning that there were very few Republicans, and they certainly did not pose a threat electorally. Presidential elections were not contested. Senate elections were not contested. House seats, by and large, were not contested. There are always a few exceptions. There were some places that are called mountain republicanisms, but most of the South was solidly Democratic.
Okay. What was Thurgood Marshall's role?
Well, Thurgood Marshall's role was significant because he was one of the chief litigators for the NAACP. He was the one who would, he had a very good courtroom presence and was extremely gifted with regard to the law. He's oftentimes given exclusive credit, which is too much, but he was foremost in the NAACP's ideas and promoting those ideas.
Okay. How did the various Supreme Court justices react to the case of Smith versus Albright?
Well, one of the things that was important is that the court had held only a couple of decades before that the white primary was constitutional. When the court hands down the decision, and it was an 8-1 decision, Smith versus Albright. The Stanley Reed hands down the opinion, and he writes the opinion applying a previous court case called U.S. versus Classic, which said that Congress could regulate not just the general election but primary elections as well. And this goes to the changes in the United States Supreme Court. Part of FDR and the New Deal and the pressure on the court, FDR's court packing plan, was that the court changed its jurisprudence quite dramatically from prior to World War II to certainly after World War II. So when the court simply applies the notion that clearly a white primary controlled by the Democratic Party is state action, and they hand down what's known as the public action doctrine, which is that the state, even if it empowers private individuals to act on its behalf, that's still state action, and that's a bit of a legal abstraction that often students miss. But what the court was really saying was that the state couldn't hide behind what I would call shenanigans, sort of granting the Democratic Party the ability to hide behind these legal fictions. It is important that the only justice, 7 of the justices on the court had been nominated by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and the only one, or one of the only ones who was not, Owen Roberts. In his dissent, he was pretty upset that the court had discarded what he considered to be stare decisis. So this whole period in Smith versus Albright is one of the important cases. Demonstrates how different the court was prior to World War II, and then really 1937 is the key, but certainly by the time FDR has gotten the opportunity to replace many of the older justices on the United States Supreme Court, the court has swung FDR's way.
Okay. And finally, what impact did the case have in Louisiana?
Well, I think that, again, this is going to have a far-reaching influence on all southern states. And this was, again, going to be After Smith versus Allwright, Southern states, if they wanted to, and they did want to continue to keep African Americans from voting in large numbers, they had to resort to those old techniques that they had tried previously, and these were poll taxes and literacy tests and constitutional interpretation tests. And these were very problematic. One very important point is that by using the white primary, that could be a group action, so you effectively excluded whole groups of people. You didn't have to individually single out individuals to prevent them from voting. You would just prevent all African Americans from participating in the Democratic primary. This was going to then force Southern states to adopt these individual exclusionary techniques. And really it signals the beginning of the end for the Solid South, and Louisiana had a slightly different history than some of the southern states because of the Huey and Earl Long, but by and large Louisiana was in concert with other southern states in trying to keep African Americans from voting.
You see a pretty direct line between this and Brown?
I think it's probably the point that I would want to stress is that the NAACP strategy, and this frustrated many more radical folks who wanted quicker change. The NAACP understood that the law does not typically move dramatically, it moves slowly. And Plessy versus Ferguson had been on the books for a long time, and so you had to gradually move the court. And there is no doubt that Smith versus Allwright is an important court case. And it comes about, we generally say that the NAACP did not litigate during World War II, that in our time of crisis during the war, that they decided not to push as hard with regard to this. And again, the NAACP is criticized by, at the time and even subsequently, for being too gradualist. But there's no doubt Smith versus Allwright is an enormously important step because it establishes that state action, even by private actors, is covered by the 14th Amendment. And really, the key to Smith versus Allwright, and unfortunately so many of the court cases, is it's under the 14th Amendment and under the Equal Protection Clause, typically, than under the 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment should have been more easily applied to these sorts of situations. Congress should enforce the 15th Amendment, preventing states from not allowing African Americans to vote. But the NAACP's very important strategy, pulling apart Plessy versus Ferguson bit by bit. And if I could say one sort of central point, is it was moving the court away from abstract legal principles, the notion that the Democratic primary was a private club, was a legal fiction that most laypersons wouldn't even entertain. I mean, it wouldn't even be a question. But that's the funny thing about law, is law and lawyers can often get tied up in quite formal arguments.
Why do you think nobody remembers it now?
I think in part because when you talk about a white primary, it doesn't seem to be as egregious, as offensive, as dramatic as literacy tests or constitutional interpretation tests. But I also think it is largely forgotten because it comes so early. I mean, it's 1944 when Smith versus Allwright comes to Brown. I mean, you're not going to have Brown for another 10 years, and you have a whole series of very dramatic incidents that take place from 44 to 54. The NAACP's had been working, I mean, always to try and get Plessy versus Ferguson and other very cramped court decisions that really gutted the Civil War amendments. And so Smith versus Allwright is a very important piece, but it's not the most dramatic piece.
So it's sort of eclipsed.
It does get eclipsed by, I mean, Brown has the tendency to overshadow all of these important court cases. I mean, the NAACP does not decide to go after the separate part of Plessy versus Ferguson until quite late, until the 1950 Supreme Court decisions. They initially tried to demonstrate how ridiculous it was to say that you could have separate and equal facilities. So they would show a law school in Texas that was the African American law school, and then compare it to the University of Texas Law School, and it didn't take too much consideration to see that they were certainly separate but were not equal. And so Smith versus Allwright is a more abstract, but it also demonstrates the court was moving in that direction, and the NAACP understood that. And it's a very important step toward what would eventually be Brown versus Board of Education.
All right. That's all.